I told him no. I looked into his tired, sunken eyes, and I told him no. He was kneeling on the cracked pavement outside my shop, his hands shaking, his voice barely above a whisper, and I turned my back on him like he was nothing. I didn't know that in exactly 11 days, my own daughter would ask me one question that would break me completely and force me to face the man I had become. If you have ever turned away from someone who needed you, if you have ever justified your own coldness with 100 excuses, then stay with me until the end, because this story is not just mine. It might be yours too. Before we begin, if stories like this move you, take a moment now to follow this channel, because what happened next changed the direction of my entire life, and I don't think I will ever be the same person again. My name doesn't matter. What matters is who I was before that autumn and who I became after it. I owned a small bakery on the corner of a busy street, the kind of place where the smell of fresh bread pulled people in from 2 blocks away. I had built that business with my own hands, brick by brick, loaf by loaf, starting with nothing but a rented oven and a stubborn belief that hard work was the only thing anyone owed the world. I believed that fiercely. I believed it the way some people believe in God. Hard work and you earn everything. Fail to work hard and you deserve nothing. That belief had a cost, though I didn't see it at the time. It made me hard. It made me look at struggling people and feel not sympathy, but suspicion. Somewhere along the way, I had convinced myself that anyone asking for help was simply too lazy to work for it. I don't know exactly when that belief took root in me. Maybe it started when I was young, watching my own father struggle and refuse charity, telling me that a man who begs has already lost the war inside himself. My father was proud to the point of foolishness. He would rather go hungry than accept a coin from a neighbor. And somehow, without meaning to, I had absorbed that same pride and twisted it into something colder. I turned his stubbornness into judgment. I turned his self-reliance into contempt for anyone who couldn't do the same. So when the old beggar first appeared outside my bakery that autumn, sitting against the brick wall with a torn blanket and a small tin cup, I didn't see a human being in pain. I saw an inconvenience. I saw someone who might scare away my customers. I saw someone who, in my mind, simply hadn't tried hard enough in life. He was there almost every single day, thin, fragile, with a long white beard and eyes that seemed to carry decades of exhaustion. His clothes were patched together so many times that you couldn't tell what the original fabric had even looked like. He never made a scene. He never shouted or begged loudly like some others did. He simply sat there, quiet, holding out his cup with a kind of dignity that, looking back now, I completely failed to notice. Every morning when I unlocked my shop, I would glance at him and feel a flicker of irritation rather than compassion. Some days I would mutter under my breath for him to move somewhere else. Other days I ignored him so completely that it was as if his presence didn't register as real to me. My employees would sometimes offer him a piece of bread when I wasn't looking, and when I found out, I scolded them, telling them we couldn't afford to feed every stranger who sat on our doorstep. I told them kindness like that would attract more beggars, more inconvenience, more trouble for the business. I want you to sit with that for a moment. I want you to understand how deeply wrong I was and how comfortable I had become in that wrongness. I had built walls around my heart so high that I couldn't even see the person suffering 3 feet away from me every single day. My daughter was 7 years old that year. She was the softest part of me, the only person who could make me laugh after a long, exhausting day. She had her mother's eyes and a curiosity about the world that never seemed to run out of questions. Her mother had passed away when she was just a baby, so it had been the 2 of us for years, learning how to navigate life together,
Me trying my best to raise her while running the bakery, and her trying her best to understand a father who worked far too much and smiled far too little. She used to come to the shop after school and sit at the little table near the window, drawing pictures or doing her homework while I worked, and every single day she watched the old man outside. I didn't realize how closely she was watching, how much she noticed the things I refused to see. One afternoon, she came up to me holding half of her sandwich, the one I had packed for her that morning, and she asked if she could give it to him. I told her no. I told her sharply, actually, in a tone I still regret to this day. I told her that if she gave him food, he would just come back expecting more, and that we couldn't be responsible for every hungry person in this world. She looked at me with such confusion in her eyes, the kind of confusion only a child can have when the adult they trust most says something that doesn't match the goodness they feel inside themselves. She didn't argue. She just quietly put her sandwich back into her bag and went back to her drawing. But something in her expression stayed with me longer than I wanted to admit. That should have been the moment I woke up. It wasn't. I kept walking past him. I kept ignoring the way his hands trembled in the cold, the way his eyes would follow customers walking in with warm bread while his stomach visibly ached with hunger. I told myself it wasn't my problem. I told myself the city had shelters for people like him, that charity organizations existed for exactly this purpose, that it wasn't my job to personally save every broken person on the street. I had convinced myself so thoroughly that I almost believed I was being reasonable rather than cruel. Then came the day everything started to shift, though I still didn't fully understand it yet. It was raining hard that afternoon, one of those relentless autumn storms that flood the gutters and send everyone running for shelter. I was closing up the shop a little early because business had slowed to nothing in the downpour. As I stepped outside to lock the door, I saw him still sitting there, drenched completely, shivering violently, his thin blankets soaked through and offering no protection at all. Most people would have felt their heart break at that sight. I felt annoyed that he was still there, taking up space in front of my closed shop. But then something happened that I did not expect. A young woman, a complete stranger, stopped in the rain. She didn't have an umbrella either. She knelt down next to him, and I watched as she took off her own coat, soaked as it already was, and wrapped it around his shoulders. She stayed with him for several minutes, talking to him gently, checking that he was all right, before finally continuing on her way, leaving her coat behind. I stood there under my shop's awning, dry and comfortable, watching a stranger show more humanity toward this old man than I had shown him in months of walking past him every single day. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I had my own struggles, my own daughter to raise, my own bakery to keep afloat. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop replaying that image. The stranger kneeling in the rain, the old man's trembling gratitude, my own indifference standing dry under a roof I had built, with hands that had never once reached out to help someone who truly needed it. Still, I didn't change. Not yet. Sometimes the hardest walls take the longest to crack, even when you can feel them beginning to weaken. A few days later, something happened that finally forced a crack into that wall. I was at the counter helping a customer when I heard a commotion outside. I stepped out to see a group of teenage boys mocking the old man, laughing at him, one of them even knocking over his tin cup and scattering the few coins he had collected that day across the wet pavement. He didn't yell at them. He didn't fight back. He simply knelt down, slowly, painfully, his old joints clearly aching, and began collecting his coins, one by one, while the boys laughed and walked away. Something in me stirred watching that.
Not enough to act, not yet, but enough to notice, enough to feel a small, uncomfortable pull in my chest that I quickly pushed back down, telling myself it wasn't my responsibility to fix every injustice happening on a public sidewalk. That evening, my daughter came home from school in tears. At first, I panicked, thinking something terrible had happened to her, but when I finally got her to speak, she told me that her teacher had read the class a story about kindness, about how the smallest act of generosity can change someone's entire life. And she told me, through her tears, that she had thought of the old man outside our shop the entire time the teacher was reading. She asked me why we never helped him when we clearly had enough bread to spare every single day. I gave her some half-hearted answer about the world being complicated, about grown-up things she wouldn't understand yet. But she looked at me, this 7-year-old girl with her mother's eyes, and she asked me the question that would haunt me for the rest of my life. She asked me, "Papa, if it was you sitting there in the rain and I walked past you every day without helping, would that be okay?" I didn't have an answer. I opened my mouth to respond with something dismissive, something to end the conversation quickly the way I always did when things got uncomfortable. But no words came out, because the honest answer was no, it would not be okay. If it were me sitting there, cold and hungry and humiliated, I would want someone, anyone, to see me as a human being worth helping. And yet I had walked past that exact scenario every single day, refusing to extend to a stranger what I would desperately want extended to myself. That question cracked something inside me that I didn't even know was still capable of feeling. I thought about my father, about his stubborn pride, about how that pride had trickled down into me and turned into something far uglier than self-reliance. I thought about the stranger in the rain who had given her coat without a second thought. I thought about the old man collecting his scattered coins with trembling, aching hands while boys laughed at him. And I thought about my daughter's face, confused and disappointed the day I had told her not to give away half her sandwich. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat in the dark kitchen for hours, turning that question over and over in my mind, feeling something I hadn't felt in years. Shame. Real, deep, uncomfortable shame. Not the kind that makes excuses, but the kind that forces you to finally see yourself clearly, without any of the justifications you've built up over time to protect your own comfort. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise. I went into the bakery, and I baked, not for customers, but for him. I made a fresh loaf, still warm, wrapped it carefully, and I walked outside before the shop even opened. He was already there, sitting in his usual spot, his eyes half closed with exhaustion. When I knelt down in front of him, actually knelt at eye level with him for the first time since he had started sitting there, he looked at me with a mixture of surprise and caution, as if bracing himself for another rejection. I handed him the bread. My hands were shaking, though I told myself it was just the cold morning air. He took it slowly, staring at me like he couldn't quite believe what was happening, and then he said something I will never forget. He thanked me, not just for the bread, but for finally seeing him. He said that most people walked past him like he was a shadow, like he didn't exist at all, and that the hardest part of being poor wasn't the hunger or the cold, but the invisibility, the feeling that you had disappeared from the world's conscience entirely while your body was still very much alive and suffering. Something broke open in my chest hearing those words. I sat down next to him, right there on the cold, damp pavement in my apron, and for the first time I actually asked him about his life. I learned that his name was Jose, that he had once worked as a carpenter for over 30 years, that he had built furniture for half the families in this city with his own 2 hands, until an illness took his wife, drained his savings, and left him alone with a body too old and too tired to hold a hammer steady anymore.
He had no children of his own, no family left to turn to, just the street and the kindness or cruelty of strangers who walked past him every single day. I asked him why he never asked me directly for food when I owned a bakery right in front of where he sat every day, and he said something that stayed with me longer than almost anything else in this entire story. He said he had asked me once, months ago, quietly, and I had told him to move along because he was scaring away my customers. He said after that he simply stopped asking, not out of anger, but because he had learned long ago that some doors, once closed, are better left untried again. I didn't remember that moment. I had said so many dismissive things to so many people over the years that his specific request had blurred into the background noise of my own indifference. But hearing him describe it, hearing the quiet resignation in his voice, I felt something inside me shatter completely. I had not just failed to help a stranger, I had actively, deliberately turned away someone who had reached out to me directly, and I had done it so casually that I hadn't even remembered doing it. From that day forward, everything changed. I started bringing him breakfast every single morning before the shop opened. Not out of guilt, though guilt was certainly part of it at first, but because I had finally started to see him, really see him, as a person with a history, with dignity, with a life that mattered just as much as mine did, even though fate had dealt him a crueler hand. My daughter noticed the change immediately. She started joining me some mornings, sitting with Osei, listening to his stories about the furniture he used to build, the wood he used to carve, the wife he had loved for over 25 years. She would bring him small drawings, and he kept every single one of them tucked carefully inside his worn jacket, telling her they were the most beautiful things anyone had given him in years. Word began to spread through the neighborhood about the change in me, about the old man who now had a warm meal every morning and a place to sit that people no longer walked past so easily. Other shop owners started doing the same for him and for others like him. I offered him small tasks around the bakery, simple things at first, sweeping, organizing, tasks that let him earn something rather than simply receive charity, because I learned that dignity mattered to him just as much as food did. Eventually, as his strength slowly returned with proper meals and warmth, I gave him a small permanent job helping manage deliveries, work that used his hands again in a way that seemed to bring life back into his tired eyes.
Karma has a strange way of circling back when you least expect it. Months later, my bakery faced its own crisis. A fire broke out in the building next door late one night and spread quickly toward my shop before the fire department could arrive. It was Osei, sleeping nearby that night because I had finally convinced him to stay in a small room above the bakery instead of the street, who woke up first, smelled the smoke, and banged on every door in the building until everyone was safely outside. The bakery suffered damage, but nothing that couldn't be rebuilt. My daughter and I were completely safe because a man I had once dismissed as worthless had saved us without a second thought. I stood outside that night, watching firefighters battle the flames, watching smoke curl into the dark sky, and I understood something with a clarity that has never left me since. The kindness we give away doesn't disappear into nothing. It doesn't vanish once it leaves our hands. It moves through the world in ways we cannot predict, circling back to us through paths we never could have imagined, sometimes saving us in return when we least expect it, and sometimes simply proving that the walls we build around our hearts only ever end up trapping us inside our own coldness. I think about that night often. I think about how close I came to living my entire life without ever truly seeing another human being's pain. I think about how easily I could have continued walking past Osei every single day, comfortable in my justifications, secure in my belief that his suffering was not my responsibility. And I think about my daughter,
7 years old, asking me a question with more wisdom than I had accumulated in decades of adult living. If it was you sitting there in the rain and I walked past you every day without helping, would that be okay? That question didn't just change how I treated a stranger on the street. It changed how I saw the entire world. It changed how I raised my daughter afterward, teaching her not through lectures, but through actions, showing her every single day that the measure of a person isn't found in how much they accumulate for themselves, but in how they treat those who have nothing left to offer in return except their gratitude. Osei stayed with us for the remaining years of his life, becoming something closer to family than employee, teaching my daughter woodworking in his final years, passing down skills and stories that she still carries with her today. When he passed away peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by warmth and dignity instead of cold pavement and indifference, I understood that the greatest gift he had given me wasn't his warning that saved our building from the fire. It was the chance to become a better version of myself before it was too late. If this story moved something inside you the way it moved something inside me, I want you to carry this question with you the next time you walk past someone who is struggling, someone who is invisible to the rest of the world. Ask yourself honestly, if it were you sitting there, would you want to be seen or would you want to be walked past? Before you go, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to this channel because stories like this one deserve to be heard and small acts of kindness deserve to be remembered. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today because you never know whose heart it might quietly begin to change the same way mine was changed by one simple question from a 7-year-old girl who saw the world more clearly than I ever had.